Before dawn on July 10, 1945, Argentine fishermen working the waters of Mar del Plata spotted something that made absolutely no sense. Emerging from the pre-dawn mist, running silently on the surface with no navigation lights, was the unmistakable silhouette of a large submarine. Not an Argentine vessel, not a British one. The lines were unmistakably German. 2 months had passed since the fall of the Third Reich. 2 months since Admiral Dönitz had ordered every U-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine to surface, fly a black flag of surrender, and proceed to the nearest Allied port. The war in Europe was over, and yet here, gliding through the cold South Atlantic darkness toward an Argentine naval base, was a fully crewed German submarine with 54 men aboard and secrets it refused to give up. This is the story of U-530, the U-boat that should never have existed in July 1945, and the mystery it left behind that historians still argue about today. To understand how U-530 ended up in Argentina, you have to understand what kind of vessel she was and what she was built to do. Laid down at the Deutsche Werft shipyard in Hamburg on December 8, 1941, U-530 was a Type IXC C-40 submarine, one of the most capable long-range boats the Kriegsmarine ever produced. She was launched on July 28, 1942, and commissioned into service on October 14th of that same year. At roughly 252 feet in length and displacing over 1,100 tons when surfaced, the Type IXC C-40 was not built for quick raids close to home. It was built for endurance, for distance, for operating alone, far from any friendly port in waters where help would never come. The class had a range exceeding 13,000 nautical miles, and with the addition of a snorkel device late in the war, could travel submerged for days at a time, drawing air from the surface through a retractable tube while running diesel engines below the waterline. These were machines designed to disappear into the ocean and not come back until the mission was done. U-530 carried 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 at the stern, and could bring up to 14 torpedoes on an operational patrol. Earlier in the war, her class mounted a 105mm deck gun for surface engagements, though by 1944 the Kriegsmarine had stripped most of these weapons from boats heading into Allied-dominated waters, where surfacing at all had become a death sentence. Her conning tower carried anti-aircraft armament and radar detection equipment, and her crew of between 44 and 54 officers and enlisted men represented some of the most technically trained sailors in the German Navy. Under her original commanding officer, Kapitänleutnant Kurt Lange, U-530 completed 6 war patrols that were, by any measure, a credible combat record. She sank 2 Allied vessels totaling over 12,000 gross register tons and damaged a third. She proved herself a capable boat. But by late 1944, capable was no longer enough. The Atlantic had changed entirely. Allied air power, long-range patrol aircraft, coordinated convoy escort groups, and ultra-intelligence decrypting German naval codes had turned the ocean into a killing field for U-boats. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in German submarines during the war, nearly 28,000 never came home. Whole flotillas had been annihilated. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had once come terrifyingly close to strangling Britain, was now a battle the Germans were simply losing. Every patrol that departed was less likely to return. It was into this collapsing strategic situation that, in January 1945, command of U-530 passed to Oberleutnant Otto Wermuth. He was 24 years old. This would be his first command. Wermuth's appointment came at the worst possible moment in the war, and the orders he received reflected just how desperate the Kriegsmarine's strategic thinking had become. On March 3, 1945, U-530 departed from Kristiansand in Norway, spent 10 days working through Horten on the Oslo Fjord, and then, on March 13th, put out to sea with orders to conduct commerce warfare in the Western Atlantic. The objective was to disrupt Allied shipping along the American eastern seaboard, the same waters where U-boats had terrorized convoys in the early years of the war. But 1945 was not 1942. The transit from Norway to the American coast required weeks of careful, mostly submerged navigation around Britain, across the open Atlantic, and into waters now blanketed with Allied air and naval patrols. U-530 reached the North American coast by late April, initially probing near Halifax before moving south toward the sea lanes off New York. Between May 4th and May 7th, 1945, Wermuth's crew fired 9 torpedoes at Allied convoys in the waters near the New York coast. Not a single one connected. The targets were missed, the weapons malfunctioned, or defensive maneuvering by convoy escorts spoiled every firing solution. These 9 failed shots were the last combat actions U-530 would ever take. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The message from Admiral Dönitz, the man Hitler had appointed as his successor before dying in his Berlin bunker, reached U-boats at sea with the highest possible priority. The order was unambiguous. All hostilities were to cease immediately. Every submarine still at sea was to surface, display a black flag, and proceed to the nearest Allied port to surrender. Dozens of boats complied. Others, under the provisions of what was called Operation Regenbogen, scuttled themselves rather than hand their vessels to the enemy. In the chaotic days after May 8th, the fate of Germany's remaining submarines was being decided one boat at a time. U-530 was approximately 1,000 miles east of Puerto Rico when the surrender message came through, and Otto Wermuth made a choice that would follow him for the rest of his life. He did not surrender, he did not scuttle, he turned south, and he started running. Wermuth later told Allied interrogators that he had doubted the authenticity of the surrender message, that he believed it might be an Allied deception, a trick to lure German submarines to the surface where they could be destroyed without a fight. This explanation was treated with considerable skepticism by investigators, and it deserves scrutiny. The Dönitz surrender signal was broadcast repeatedly at the highest priority and was received clearly by German submarines across the Atlantic. Other commanders in far worse positions accepted the message and complied. What is harder to establish, and what Wermuth never fully explained to anyone's satisfaction, is what he actually intended to do for the next 63 days. What is certain is this. From mid-May through early July 1945, U-530 conducted one of the most carefully concealed long-distance ocean transits in the history of submarine warfare. The boat ran submerged during daylight hours, using the snorkel to run the diesel engines and recharge batteries, surfacing only at night to make better speed. The crew maintained strict radio silence, transmitting nothing that could reveal their position. They dumped everything overboard that might be used as evidence against them, or that might be of value to Allied intelligence. Wermuth ordered the remaining torpedoes thrown into the sea, all but one defective weapon whose battery had already failed. The ship's codebooks went over the side. The logbook, the official record of every position, every order, every action taken since leaving Norway, was destroyed. All ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns was jettisoned. The radar equipment, the cryptographic materials, even the crew's personal identification documents were discarded. When U-530 finally approached the Argentine coast, she was a boat that had deliberately erased her own history. The route Wermuth acknowledged in interrogation took the submarine east of Bermuda, across the equator somewhere near the St. Peter and Paul rocks in the mid-Atlantic, then south through the South Atlantic toward Argentina. Based on the timeline and the boat's known capabilities, the journey at snorkel speed traveling mostly submerged during daylight hours would have taken roughly 60 to 65 days. The timeline, from May 10th when U-530 departed the New York area to July 10th when she arrived at Mar del Plata, is approximately 61 days. The mathematics, while tight, and not impossible for a Type IXC operating under rigorous fuel and speed discipline. But those mathematics leave almost no time for anything other than travelling, and yet Argentine naval investigators, the American intelligence teams that followed them, and independent researchers for decades afterward, have struggled with one central question. If Wermuth was simply running away from the war, why the elaborate destruction of evidence? Why the meticulous elimination of every record that might tell investigators exactly where U-530 had been? On the night of July 9th, 1945, U-530 approached the Argentine coastline in darkness. According to Wermuth's later account, he had considered surrendering at Miramar, a smaller coastal town south of Buenos Aires, before deciding that Mar del Plata, the site of Argentina's main naval base, would be more suitable. The submarine spent time near Miramar before moving north again, arriving off the harbour entrance at Mar del Plata at roughly 3 in the morning on July 10th. Just before sunrise, with the Argentine fishing fleet already working the coastal waters, U-530 made its move. The crew raised a large white flag. They turned on their navigation lights, which they had carefully kept dark throughout the entire voyage. Wermuth used the boat's signal lamp to blink the words Alman Submarino, German submarine, toward the harbour control tower. According to a contemporary account published in Time magazine, the submarine slipped past a harbour sentry who had his back turned to the sea before the surrender signal finally reached Argentine naval personnel and brought them running to the docks. What followed was almost surreally ordinary. The 54 crewmen of U-530 were brought ashore. They were given hot food, they were given haircuts, and then they were placed under guard. The Argentine Navy had a German World War II submarine on its hands, 63 days after the war in Europe had ended, and no explanation that made any sense. The interrogations of Otto Wermuth began almost immediately, and continued under both Argentine and American authority over the following weeks. He acknowledged being operational off New York during the first week of May. He confirmed that he had received the surrender order. He admitted to destroying the logbook and discarding the torpedoes. He explained that he had chosen Argentina because he believed, wrongly as it turned out, that Argentina had remained neutral and would offer his crew better treatment than an allied country might. He was apparently unaware, or claimed to be unaware, that Argentina had quietly declared war on Germany in March 1945, just weeks before the German collapse. On the central questions that investigators cared most about, however, Wermuth gave very little. He could not satisfactorily explain why the voyage had taken over 2 months, when a direct route at the speeds the boat was capable of should have been achievable in somewhat less time. He acknowledged the missing logbook and the destroyed documents, but offered no explanation beyond standard compliance with standing orders about disposing of classified materials before surrender. He denied categorically that U-530 had carried any passengers, any cargo of special value, any high-ranking Nazi officials, any fugitives of any kind. Then, investigators discovered something that made Wermuth's evasiveness look considerably more calculated. Before entering the harbour at Mar del Plata, he had deliberately sabotaged U-530's diesel engines by pouring acid into them. He initially told Argentine officers that the engines had malfunctioned on their own during the voyage. Only later did he admit to the deliberate destruction. He had made the boat useless. He had ensured that whatever she was and wherever she had been, she could not simply be turned around and sailed somewhere else. The Argentine Navy's official investigators noted something else. The officer who presented himself at Mar del Plata as Otto Wermuth, according to witnesses, was tall and blond. The real Otto Wermuth, as documented from earlier records, was short and dark-haired. Argentine naval intelligence quietly raised the possibility that the man who surrendered U-530 was not the same man who had commanded her when she left Norway, that one of the inflatable dinghies that should have been aboard was missing, that someone or several someones had departed U-530 before she entered the harbour. These details have never been resolved. they have only deepened the mystery. The arrival of U-530 unleashed a storm of speculation that swept through Argentina, Brazil, and the Allied nations within days. Brazilian Admiral Jorge Dodsworth Martins publicly accused U-530 of having torpedoed the Brazilian cruiser Bahia, which had been lost on July 4, 1945, with 334 men killed. The timing was suggestive. U-530 was certainly somewhere in the South Atlantic around that date, and the accusation gained traction in the Brazilian press before investigators could establish the facts. A separate Brazilian officer suggested that U-530 might actually have come from Japan, implying some last-ditch Axis collaboration that the submarine's unexpected appearance in the South Atlantic seemed to support. The most sensational claim came from an Argentine newspaper reporter who claimed to have seen a provincial police report describing a mysterious submarine surfacing off the remote Patagonian coast in the weeks before July 10th, offloading a high-ranking officer and a civilian, and that the civilian was Adolf Hitler, traveling with Eva Braun in men's clothing. The story spread rapidly. The FBI in the United States received unconfirmed reports along similar lines. In the chaos of post-war Europe, where Hitler's body had not been publicly displayed, and where the Soviet Union was being secretive about what it had actually found in the bunker, the possibility that Hitler had escaped seemed, to some people, at least imaginable. The fever only intensified 5 weeks later, when a second German submarine appeared at Mar del Plata. On August 17, 1945, U-977, commanded by Oberleutnant Heinz Schaffer, surrendered to Argentine authorities. Schaffer's boat was a Type IXC, shorter range than U-530, and he had made the voyage from Norway in an even more remarkable fashion, conducting what he later described as a 66-day continuous submerged snorkel passage, one of the longest in the history of submarine warfare. Schaffer's papers were intact, his logbook present, his cruise story consistent, but the simple fact of a second German submarine arriving in Argentina weeks after the first gave conspiracy theorists everything they needed to argue that these were not isolated accidents of war, but coordinated missions. Schaffer himself, in his 1952 book about the voyage, addressed the accusations directly, noting that an Anglo-American commission in Argentina essentially accused him of helping Hitler escape, which he denied. He pointed out that his intact navigational logs documented his route and timeline in a way that U-530's destroyed records could not. He and Wermuth, he noted, had never met until American authorities introduced them after both crews were in Allied custody. The Allied investigations were comprehensive, and their conclusions, while frustrating to those who wanted dramatic revelations, were consistent. Physical inspection of U-530 found no secret compartments beyond standard storage areas. The crew, interrogated separately and repeatedly by both Argentine and American intelligence officers, gave accounts that were consistent with each other and consistent with Wermuth's general narrative. The Brazilian inquiry into the loss of the Bahia determined conclusively that the cruiser had been destroyed not by any torpedo, but by an accidental onboard explosion during a gunnery drill on July 4th. The accusation against U-530 was dropped. Exhaustive Allied investigation into Hitler's death, drawing on Soviet evidence, physical remains found in the Berlin bunker, eyewitness testimony from bunker survivors, and intelligence gathered from captured Nazi officials, produced a conclusion with very high confidence. Hitler died in Berlin in late April 1945, did not escape. The elaborate conspiracy theory requiring his transportation by submarine across the Atlantic fell apart on the basic evidence that there was no mystery to explain. He was dead before U-530 would even have had a plausible opportunity to collect him. The Argentine naval investigators' suspicion that there may have been a mutiny aboard U-530 and that the tall blonde officer who presented himself as Wermuth was an imposter was never confirmed or conclusively resolved. The missing inflatable dinghy was never accounted for. The acid in the engines remained a deliberate act of destruction for which Wermuth's explanation was never fully satisfying. What historians have generally concluded is this. Otto Wermuth, at 24 years old and on his first command, made a decision after May 8th not to comply with the surrender order, for reasons that may have included genuine doubt about the message's authenticity, personal fear of Allied captivity, and a belief that Argentina offered better prospects for him and his crew. He then spent the better part of 2 months travelling south in a submarine that was not going particularly fast, running cautiously to avoid Allied patrols, destroying every piece of evidence that might allow investigators to reconstruct exactly what he had done and where he'd been. He sabotaged his engines before entering port to prevent the boat from being simply sailed away. He refused to cooperate fully with interrogators, and the specific details of what U-530 was actually doing during those 63 days remain, decades later, unknown. What happened to U-530 and her crew after the surrender followed the machinery of Allied post-war administration. The Argentine Navy held the crew under guard for several weeks before agreeing to hand both boat and men over to the United States in the spirit of Allied cooperation. The crew was transferred to American custody for further interrogation. U-530 herself was towed first to the Panama Canal and then up the American East Coast, briefly displayed at several port cities as a public exhibit of a defeated enemy. The men of U-530 were eventually repatriated to Germany in 1947 after 2 years in captivity. No crew members were charged with any criminal offence beyond the simple failure to comply with the surrender order, which was not ultimately prosecuted. Otto Wermuth survived the war and lived into old age. Details of his later life are sparse, and he gave very few interviews in the decades that followed. The man who commanded the last German submarine to surrender, who destroyed his own logbook and acid-burned his own engines, and who to the end never fully accounted for 63 days of ocean, apparently chose to live quietly with whatever he knew. The final fate of U-530 came on November 28, 1947, in the cold waters off Cape Cod. The American submarine USS Toro lined up U-530 in her periscope and fired a live torpedo. The weapon struck, the old German boat broke apart and she sank to the ocean floor. What had departed Norway on a combat mission in March 1945 ended as a practice target. The legacy of U-530 is disproportionate to its actual wartime record, which was modest. It sank 2 ships, it damaged 1 more, it fired 9 torpedoes in its last patrol and hit nothing. By any conventional military measure, it was not a significant vessel, but the story it created in the summer of 1945 was something else entirely. Argentina's reputation as a destination for fleeing Nazis, while mostly built on the documented post-war arrivals of war criminals travelling by more conventional means, drew sustenance from the arrival of U-530 and U-977 at Mar del Plata. The image of German submarines slipping into South American harbours in the months after the war's end became part of the cultural mythology of the immediate post-war era, feeding decades of speculation, novels, films, and conspiracy theories about what the Third Reich had hidden and where it had sent its secrets when the end came. The interrogation of Wermuth and his crew prompted Allied intelligence agencies to investigate post-war Nazi escape networks far more aggressively than they might otherwise have done. In that indirect sense, U-530's arrival contributed to the eventual documentation of what the historian Gerald Steinacher and others have called the rat lines, the organized networks through which genuine war criminals did eventually reach Argentina and other South American countries. Those men came by air and by sea on commercial vessels, not by submarine, but U-530 put investigators on alert. What actually happened aboard U-530 during those 63 vanished days is a question that cannot now be answered with certainty. The logbook is gone. The men who might have known are dead. The boat itself has been on the ocean floor since 1947. The Argentine intelligence files from July 1945, the American interrogation transcripts, the documents declassified in later decades, All of them together do not produce a complete picture. They produce a plausible one. A young commander made an unauthorized decision, spent 2 months running from a war that was already over, destroyed his evidence, and surrendered to a country he mistakenly believed would shelter him. The submarine that slipped through the mist into Mar del Plata on that winter morning in July 1945 left behind exactly the kind of questions that refuse to go away. Not because the fantastic answer is necessarily true, but because no one has ever been able to prove with complete certainty that it is false. And in the end, that uncertainty is the most enduring thing U-530 left behind.